Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Waldman, Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Tuesday, October 24th, 2017. Boy, I sound a little bit muffled here. Let's make sure I have some volume in my headphones so I can hear myself. I hope everything's going okay out there. If it's okay for you, it's okay for me. I don't mind. I'm a little spaced out today. There's been a lot of work going on here at Kagro in the Morning World Headquarters. Everything gets the thumbs up from Justice. Thanks very much, Justice, for standing by. I know you got a lot to do today. So what do you want to do today? We had to do a pre-recorded show yesterday. We probably could have gotten away with a live show for the most part. The work is quieting down a little bit, but boy, we have some more scheduled. They're really going to be disrupting things here in a couple of weeks. So, well, you know, we'll see how we deal with it. We managed to get through yesterday okay. I'm sure between pre-recorded shows and you guys putting up with a lot of banging and sawing and hammering, I suppose we can get through just about anything. Daily Co's Radio is live right now, although Bill says it's simply all new right now because, you see, there's a joke coming. Kagro X, that's me, David Waldman, pre-listened to himself and is stunned. Stunned! That's right. I had recorded a show for today, but I decided I was too stunned by it, and I would, F it, I'll just do it live, as Bill O'Reilly used to say back when he was sexually assaulting people and lying about it. Oh, but he's still doing that now, of course. And it's in the news. I don't know if you've noticed. Apparently, I mean, I didn't plan on talking about this, but everybody's kind of been, I don't know, laughing, I guess, about the fact that he says he's totally innocent of this latest slander against him. He just paid $32 million to the plaintiff in the sexual harassment suits against him because he thought it would be a nice thing to do. And he's into redistribution of income, I guess. He says he has astonishing facts that are waiting for revelation to the public that will prove his innocence. And apparently the first go-round of the astonishing facts was that he had essentially the settlement agreement that he showed people, that the plaintiff said, well, I have no claims against Bill O'Reilly now that I've been paid $32 million. And he's pointing to but you see, no claims part here. That's the part that's really super interesting. Okay. Well, let's see. This morning's Twitter activity seems to center around an intentional reignition of the spat via Twitter between, what's his face? The president guy, Donald Trump, and Bob Corker, senator from Tennessee, who Trump wants you to know can't get elected dog catcher in Tennessee. Of course, he's elected statewide as a senator, but the point is supposed to be that he now thinks that Corker could not win re-election in the Senate contest. He's instead retiring. And, of course, we all know that he's only retiring because Donald Trump refused to endorse him. And that's really all it takes in Tennessee. But they're fighting today. And, Politico points out that Trump is attacking Corker just before he heads to the Hill for a GOP, as I like to say, GOP unity effort. They're having a Senate luncheon, Tuesday's Senate luncheon days for both parties, and even the independents. They eat lunch too, as it turns out. So I guess he decided he would go to the Hill and put on a show of how unified he is with his forces in the Senate, and he's, of course, attacking them instead. So what can you do? We'll see how that goes. Also, much discussion of, the awarding of the contract for re-electrifying, I guess, or bringing the electricity back online in Puerto Rico, where some 75%, I think, of the island is still largely without power, has been awarded. And you'll be happy to know it has gone to a powerhouse company. I get no pun intended. The powerhouse company is based in Whitefish, Montana, which, I don't know, maybe coincidentally is where Richard Spencer, well, it's the place Richard Spencer calls his hometown. I don't think it's really any place that he lives any serious part of the year. but also claimed as the hometown of Secretary of the Interior Ryan Zinke. It's been really interesting, and I think I saw it tweeted yesterday at some point, and I think maybe I'll be able to come up with it. But Ryan Zinke, I thought the phrasing of the tweet was kind of interesting for us, the way we regard things on the show. Here it is. Emily C. Singer, whose name I believe we called the other day. I remember it because she tweets under the actual handle of Con Emily, so the C being for Con. She got married. Remember, we talked about this. Anyway, she was retweeting Matthew Iglesias, laughing at the fact that this contract had been awarded to this very small company in this very out-of-the-way place. Emily was saying Zinke is making a name for himself as the most corrupt cabinet secretary at a time when Tom Price had to resign over misusing government funds. And so he catapults himself into the lead. Just that I was interested in the fact that she used the same kind of phrasing that we used the other day when we were trying to figure out who is the most corrupt cabinet member. However, there's a lot of articles about this, and it looks like there's more to it than just that. It doesn't really look, when you look at the sum total of the articles out there, like it is a Zinke operation, but rather just your same basic Trump grifting operation. The Washington Post, I guess, was perhaps first one out of the box with this story. I'll take a look and see what they say, whether they bother crediting anybody else on this one. But then there's a Daily Beast story which sort of broke a little later in my Twitter feed that says, remember to follow the money. Don't think of this as a Zinke thing so much as a Trump thing. Anyway, the Washington Post's piece here says, small Montana firm lands Puerto Rico's biggest contract to get the power back on. Stephen Mufson, Jack Gillum, Aaron C. Davis, and Arelis R. Hernandez have the byline on this piece from yesterday. For the sprawling effort to restore Puerto Rico's crippled electrical grid, the territory's state-owned utility has turned to a 2-year-old company from Montana that has just 2 full-time employees on the day Hurricane Maria made landfall. Okay, I guess they've probably upsized a little bit since then, now that they've got the good news, or had some inkling that they were going to get the good news that they were going to restore all of the island's electrical power. I guess really, by the way, this would mean that you might want to take a good look at whoever's heading the territory's state-owned utility there on that one too. The company, Whitefish Energy, which just screams large-scale competence to me, said last week that it had signed a $300 million contract. That's $150 million for each of the 2 people who work there, with the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority to repair and reconstruct large portions of the island's electrical infrastructure. The contract is the biggest yet issued in the troubled relief effort. I guess we need to keep in mind, a contract like that gets awarded. I guess it can be awarded to a small company, which then subcontracts all the work to other people, and most of the money then goes to the subcontractors. But all that means is that a 2-person company in Whitefish, Montana, gets to take a skim off of the top of this. Do I want Armando? Here's a question for the rest of you. Do you want me to want Armando to tell us about the electric power company? Yes, I think so. I think I demand it. That's it. I'm just going to sit here. I'm going to hold my breath until Armando tells us about the Puerto Rico Electric Company. I think it was a great show when I was a kid, the Electric Company, a great competitor to Sesame Street, but I have a feeling this one runs a little bit differently. We probably should find out everything we can about the group. I'll continue with the Washington Post story, and I am sure we'll hear from Armando in the middle of it, and we'll get some more detail about these things. The company, though, in Montana, Whitefish Energy, is going to head this thing up. Whitefish said on Monday that it has 280 workers in the territory. Those would, of course, be, I'm sure, temporary hires, using linemen from across the country, most of them as subcontractors, and the number grows on average from 10 to 20 people a day. It said it was close to completing infrastructure work that will energize some of the key industrial facilities that are critical to restarting the local economy. The power authority, known as PREPA, Puerto Rico, Electric Power, what did they say? Authority, Electric Power Authority, PREPA. Be prepared with PREPA. I'm sure that was the idea. Opted to hire Whitefish rather than activate the mutual aid arrangements it has with other utilities. For many years, such agreements have helped U.S. utilities, including those in Florida and Texas recently, to recover quickly after natural disasters. So screw that. We're going to do something different. Okay. The unusual decision to instead hire a tiny for-profit company is drawing scrutiny from Congress and comes amid concerns about bankrupt Puerto Rico's spending as it seeks to provide relief to its 3.4 million residents. That's just, let's say, 1.7 million per employee of Whitefish. Again, they have more now. I like to think of everything in terms of just the two of them. The great majority of whom, these 3.4 million residents, remain without power a month after the storm. The fact that there are so many utilities with experience in this and a huge track record of helping each other out, it is at least odd why the utility would go with Whitefish, said Susan F. Tierney, a former senior official at the Energy Department and state regulatory agencies. I'm scratching my head wondering how it all adds up. It's not that hard because you only have to divide every number by 2. I find it very simple. PREPA's executive director, Ricardo Ramos, I guess this good background before we hear from Armando on this one. Ricardo Ramos and a spokesman did not respond to emails asking why the utility didn't activate the mutual aid network. I'd like to know the answer to that. And there's probably a reasonable reason, too. But I'd like to find out. On a tour of the idled Palo Seco power plant, Ramos told reporters that Whitefish was the first company, quote, available to arrive, and they were the ones that first accepted terms and conditions for PREPA. It's a short flight, I guess, from Whitefish, Montana to Puerto Rico. Ramos said the utility is completely content with the work Whitefish is doing. The doubts that have been raised about Whitefish, from my point of view, are completely unfounded, he said, saying that concerns about Whitefish were probably spread by jealous competitors. And they may very well have been. It's just an odd pairing, I think. It's possible that even two people from Whitefish, Montana, could put together a competent response in hiring subcontractors and getting them to Puerto Rico and starting them on work. I mean, I wouldn't think the job is terribly complicated if you have some idea what it takes to repair lines. I need repairmen. Get them there, buy them plane tickets, and say, fix this stuff. You know what to do. All right, let's see. Where were we here? Whitefish officials have said that the company's expertise in mountainous areas makes it well suited for the work. Not too bad idea, right? And then it jumped at the chance, of course, when other firms were hesitating over concerns about payment. The company acknowledges it has only 2 full-time employees, when Maria struck, but says its business model calls for ramping up rapidly by hiring workers on short-term contracts. That is a terrific business model. Mine calls for that too. As soon as huge amounts of money flow to me, I will start hiring large numbers of workers to do things. Spokesman Chris Chimes, I guess, Chiames, one of the 2 employees there, I guess, dismissed criticism about the company's qualifications. We are taking personal risks and business risks in working in perilous physical and financial conditions, he said, so the carping by others is unfounded, and we stand by our work and our commitment to the people of Puerto Rico. Whitefish Energy is based in Whitefish, Montana, the hometown of Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke. Its chief executive, Andy Tekmansky, and Zinke acknowledge knowing one another. I don't know how that could not be the case in Whitefish, but only Zinke's office said in an email, because Whitefish is a small town where everybody knows everybody. Well, that was kind of part of the complaint. I mean, you can't not see that, well, I don't know, restoring power for 3.4 million people in an island territory that's actually fairly far away from where you are. Does that ordinarily fall to the 2-man company where everybody knows everybody? Well, I salute the entrepreneurial spirit and all, and we'll see how they do. but it is a little strange. One of Zinke's sons, it says, joined a friend who worked a summer job at one of Techmansky's construction sites, the email said. Whitefish said he worked as a flagger. Well, did he take a knee or did he stand during this flagging operation? One wonders. Zinke's office said he had no role in Whitefish securing the contract for work in Puerto Rico. Techmansky said Zinke was not involved. Techmansky, he's a tech man, by the way, said in an interview that the contract emerged from discussions between his company and the utility rather than from a formal bidding process. Because why would you have one of those? It's an emergency. People do such things. He said he had been in contact with the utility 2 weeks before Maria, discussing what-if scenarios of hurricane recovery. Well, that'll help get you the contract, I would guess. In the days after the hurricane, he said, it started to make sense that there was a need here for our services and others. On Thursday, Techmansky told CNN simply, we called each other. He didn't even use the internet, on which no one can tell if you're a dog, I guess. But on the phone, you'd think the barking would give it away. The scale of the disaster in Puerto Rico is far larger than anything Whitefish has handled. The company has won 2 contracts from the Energy Department, including a $172,000 contract to replace a metal pole structure and splice in 3 miles of new conductor and overhead ground wire in Arizona, which is a little different. Shortly before Maria ravaged Puerto Rico, Whitefish landed its largest federal contract, a $1.3 million deal to replace and upgrade parts of a 4.8-mile transmission line in Arizona. The company, which was listed in procurement documents as having an annual revenue of $1 million, was given 11 months to complete the work, records show. Well, that's pretty small scale, but you have to practice somewhere. Puerto Rico has 2,400 miles of transmission lines across the island and 30,000 miles of distribution lines with 300 substations. So they're saying it's a bigger project. Jeff Hawk, a spokesman for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Power Restoration Task Force, estimated that 80% of the grid has been damaged. A month after the storm, about 80% of customers remain without power. That's a good match then. 80% of the grid has been damaged and 80% of the customers are without power. So why not? It's just a small ramp up. It reminds me of the movie I just saw recently, although we all knew that this was happening. But it reminds me of contracting with the Coalition Provisional Authority, where they were just like, well, we need, what was the movie was, I can't remember the name of it, but the idea was we need bazillion bullets for Iraq and maybe also Afghanistan, and where can we get them? So we'll contract it out, and it ended up going to basically 2 guys in an office somewhere who said, I don't know, I think we can buy a lot of bullets on eBay or something and turn around and sell them back to the Army for twice the price that we bought them for. And I guess this kind of contracting goes on all over the place. There's plenty more in this article, but I have a feeling we'll get some better information if we simply just turn things over to Armando, or at least ask him some questions. Good morning, Armando. You're familiar
good morning,
with these
David.
guys, huh?
It's actually a very fascinating story.
I think it is.
A story of corruption.
It may be. All right.
I don't think there's any doubt that this is pure corruption.
Okay, I didn't get to that part yet.
Well, I don't think the article.
I think it's pretty obvious.
I don't think the article has connected the dots completely. I think that might come later.
Maybe. There's also this Daily Beast piece I have that was tweeted out, sort of with the Twitter headline of, "Hey, it's not all about Zinke. Remember to follow the money. The contractors here are huge Trump donors." So I thought it might get a little bit closer to the point of the transaction, but
there you go.
Well, what we're missing probably still here is what's the story on the island here?
All right, well, let's talk about that. The Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority, PREPA, in Spanish it's the Autoridad de Energía Eléctrica, and that's how it's known in the island, the AEE.
That's less
actually, but of course in English they call it PREPA.
It has some Spanish root.
It is what's called a public corporation formed by Puerto Rico law. The governor has the power to name not only the executive director, but the majority of the board. In essence, the government controls the electric company.
Okay.
It is owned by the government is not a privately owned company. It's none of these things. It has for 20 years been the plum for privatization, what a lot of people wanted to privatize. So privatization in Puerto Rico has been a hot topic for more than 20 years. Frankly, 20 years ago, was it? Or 19 years ago, the then governor, the father of the current governor, just so you, if you're worried about nepotism,
No,
yes, the father of the current governor at the time, his name is Pedro Rosselló, in 1998 sold the telephone company, which was a public corporation as well at the time. That sale made sense in my opinion, and most people may disagree with me because, first of all, the value of telephone companies that had just landline business was going down, and you can tell 20 years later that being just a landline phone company is not a good business.
Yeah, right. The state-owned buggy whip company also.
Exactly. It was basically a state-owned buggy. So they got actually a decent amount of money for it. I think it got sold for $4 billion.
That guy's a business genius.
To what is now Verizon. It was something else back then. You know, it was before all the mergers and whatnot.
Right. Okay.
But anyway, the PREPA was always eyed as a sell point. But believe it or not, corruption stopped that. And the reason why corruption stopped that is it was the cash cow. It actually made a lot of money. And in fact, the electric company was often the lender to other public agencies of the government. Like they sold the sewer company, or at least basically the management of the sewer company, to an outside company right around the same time. And that was not as lucrative a deal. And you can argue the merits of it, but PREPA was the cash cow. That's where the government was able to reward donors and things like that. And it had always been that way. It always made a lot of money. The electric bills in Puerto Rico were just ridiculously high. I can, relative to, I paid electric bills in New York and in Florida, and Puerto Rico's were 4 times as much for similar power. And there's a lot of reasons. There's no, you have to transport the oil, but most of it that's the cash cow. So, but over the years they drained it and they basically killed the golden goose. And now, as you know, it's in default. It should be in a Chapter 9 or Chapter 11 bankruptcy, depending on what the law would allow. There's questions at times as to whether it is part of the government and then subject to sovereign immunity. I won't bore you with all that. The end result here is it's really not good for graft anymore because it doesn't have any money. So why then this graft? Think about this deal. Why would, if you believe in the corruption theory as I do, why would the Puerto Rico government, local government, give graft to some guys in Montana?
They were hoping
Let me
to
tell
get it
you
back.
Why. The money isn't coming from Puerto Rico. It's coming from Washington. Whatever, this $300 million is not going to be paid by Puerto Rico. They may have signed the contract, but the money is going to come from Washington.
All right.
So how do I make sure I get the money from Washington to fix my power infrastructure?
Yes,
well,
okay.
If somebody in Washington says, if you hire this guy and let him wet his beak, then we'll give you the money. And what are you going to do?
Yeah, I guess that's certainly one good theory of that.
Hey, I don't have the facts now, but I am telling you that is what happened here. Puerto Rico doesn't have $300 million. The Puerto Rico Power Authority doesn't have $300 million. They owe other people $9 billion before they'd pay this, unless there's a deal. But there's no way the creditors of the Puerto Rico Power Authority are going to agree to that unless someone told them, well, you're not getting that $300 million. But we can get our power thing up, and maybe we can get some money after we can start charging people again. So that's how you get paid. So shut up and let me do this. And everybody's going along. Well, maybe not in Washington. We'll see what Congress says. But if you're looking for graft, as Mr. Trump was when he had his press conference with the governor of Puerto Rico, that's the story, in my opinion.
I think it's
the money
likely.
comes from Washington. You got to pay off somebody in Washington. Ryan Zinke has some friends in Whitefish, Montana, who have a two-person shop whose biggest contract before this one was a $1.4 million contract in Arizona.
Yes.
So, yeah, sure, let's pick them for the $300 million contract. Let's ignore the mutual aid agreement that you have where these people would come in, other power authorities from other states would come in and help you because someone in Washington said that's what you got to do. This is not coming from Puerto Rico. Do not believe that for a second.
Well, it's easy enough to believe. I mean, that's the simplest explanation, certainly, for how a Montana company, Whitefish Power Company, whatever the hell, ends up on the phone at all with PREPA. But it's odd, and I think there's certainly some details to be sussed out here. But the idea that they looked in the Puerto Rico white pages, starting with W, and got the Whitefish Montana listing and said, they have done 1.5 miles in, or it was $1.5 million in Arizona, 4 miles in Arizona. It's a lot like Arizona here, and we ought to see about hiring them because they could probably scale up. All right, well, we're going to take our first of the 3 breaks coming up here in just a minute. If you want to hang on the line, we can talk a little bit more about it on the other side.
Sure.
Welcome back to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Joining us now on the phone, it's the CEO of PREPA, and I have good news for everybody. I just got the contract, so that's pretty good. I have a screwdriver, and I am ready to go. And I think I have some wire probably down in the basement. I'm pretty sure I can subcontract for a lot of the work and have all of the necessary materials shipped over there. And, if not, I'm sure that if you check the yellow pages, there'll be an electrician coming along anytime soon. So, Armando is still with us here, and I think you have it right here. In the background, during the break, we chatted a little bit, and the basic question really, I guess, comes down to, as you said, does Puerto Rico have $300 million to spend on fixing the electrical grid? And if they if you don't think that they do, then where do you think the money is coming from and why is it happening? I guess somebody has to, make some effort, although the Trump administration has made it pretty clear that they think they can get away with literally making no effort to fix the place. But I guess the only thing that would really motivate Donald Trump and his administration to spend any amount of money, let alone $300 million of somebody's money, no matter whose it is, to direct it to Puerto Rico, it probably requires them getting a significant cut of it, and I guess this is how they would do it. I don't know what the situation is with the mutual aid agreements, like who gets paid and who doesn't, and would Puerto Rico have to pay the other utility agencies who send help for the help that they say? I imagine some money has to change hands, and although I don't know what kind of credit Puerto Rico has built up in the past, did they ever send line repairmen to Florida to put things back together?
I assume
they must, right?
I think that they did Houston as well.
I guess they would have to have participated in any of these things. The Carolinas, whenever anybody, if you have a mutual aid compact, I guess you send people.
They did have some credit there. I don't know how much, not $300 million, I'm sure.
Yeah,
but
I don't know if they keep tabs or it's just, hey, whoever gets hit, and we all go, and it all comes out in the wash. I don't know what the deal really is, but yeah, that they opted out of that is pretty interesting. I also wondered whether the workers utility workers in other states were interested in how this worked, or whether they just say, well, we're going to get hired as subcontractors anyway, so it doesn't make any difference to us. We'll get paid one way or another. Or are they sitting there saying, wait a second, what about putting us to work here in the mutual compact?
I think it's interesting the story made headlines. Who's the source on the story? Who pointed this out? Mm-hmm. Why is it in the Washington Post?
I didn't get to that.
It could just be great reporting, digging it up, or more likely somebody decided, hey, look at this.
Maybe.
And as some would say, in the story, a, quote, competitor, unquote, though I'm sure they never thought of Whitefish as a competitor before.
Right. That may be true.
But they said, we didn't get any of this. What's going on?
Yeah.
They went to the Washington Post, and they probably complained to their own, money-owned politicians in Washington. So this might be a little, a little bit of no honor among thieves.
That's almost certainly true. I could imagine that they'd have a good reason to complain. I mean, if you're sitting there having spent the money to have a workforce of hundreds of line repairmen ready to go for any contracting work, it must upset you to some extent to see it go to somebody who's done none of the preparatory work, but simply says, well, now I have a pile of cash and I'll just hire away probably all of your workers, or I will subcontract to you and you'll get an hourly rate for your workers, but you don't get the big fat slice of it that we do.
Exactly.
And that makes them upset. So I'm sure that there's probably some griping. It may also have been dug up by the reporters, too. I mean, it's a fairly obvious question. So, administration, what are you doing to get this place re-electrified? Oh, well, we've awarded a contract. Oh, yeah? To who? Whitefish Electric Power, Mom and Pop Co. Yeah, okay. Who's that? And you would look, because, I mean, if I got the answer, the answer is Whitefish. What's it? I don't know how they call themselves. But Whitefish anything. Even if they had called themselves the Supersized Whitefish Conglomerate International Inc., I would say. Whitefish. That sounds like a weird thing. I would have expected Dynaco, or, for that matter, Blackwater or something, a recognizable name. Duke Power, even, I would have thought, oh, sure, they have the power to leverage getting that giant contract, although they might not think $300 million is giant enough for them. But Whitefish is likely to make you look, I think.
I agree, especially since Zinke's flight to Whitefish was a big story. So,
yes, right.
That also could have tipped off a reporter. It's possible that it was just natural reporting. I'm skeptical of that. Think about this. It says here in the article that there was an initial payment of $3.7 million.
Okay.
So Whitefish is two people. Their yearly revenue, according to the story, is $1 million. $1 million.
Yes, so they tripled, almost quadrupled their income right off
Bill
the bat.
Riley paid 32 times the amount of their their annual revenue to settle a sexual harassment claim.
And he's still got plenty left. Okay, so quadrupled
to
their
give you
revenues.
Perspective, this is a pimple in Montana, probably, much less in the country, much less having any expertise in Puerto Rico.
Yes, well, there's I can't see any evidence so far of any presence in Montana. They live there, but they work in Arizona. I mean, what do they do in Montana?
It's nonsense. And, of course, a month later, 80%, according to the article, I'm sure it's higher, 80% of Puerto Rico is still without power. Yes. A month later. Hell of a higher there. Boy, they're really working fast, aren't they?
There's a lot of damage
there. They're probably not working fast because they don't have the money yet.
That may be the case. So,
they have $1 million in annual revenue, Dave. They got $3.7 million as initial payment, which is 400% or 370% of their
true.
historical annual revenue.
Right. It's not
is
hard
insane.
math. It's $1 million on the nose.
This is in no way could this be defended by anybody.
We'll try, but only in the negative. We'll try and defend it just to see what kind of funny things we can come up with. But this is essentially I mean, if there's literally no corruption involved in this somehow, then it's almost literally like, give me the yellow pages. I'll call somebody. Or better yet, I mean, it would make a fascinating story of entrepreneurial spirit. The story that the Whitefish guys are saying is, well, I woke up one day and I was looking at the Weather Channel, and they said a hurricane was coming to Puerto Rico. And I said, we live in the same country as Puerto Rico. Maybe this is a business opportunity. I'll call them before all the phone lines get blown down, although they mostly had been anyway. And I'll ask them, hey, if you get this second hurricane in a week or whatever the space of time was, I assume you'll have a lot of electrical power line damage. We're a repair company. Let me give you my card. And if you have a contract to give out, give us a call. I estimate that you'll probably need something in the neighborhood of $300 million worth of work. We do work. So call us. Okay. Well, I mean, do you handle this sort of thing? Wow, we work in the mountains. What mountains? Well, that is to say, I live in Montana. That's mountainous. I work in the desert, Arizona. But the point is, you have $300 million. We once made $1 million. The word million is in both. Give us a call. And they said, okay. We have an existing pact with utility companies elsewhere in the United States where they'll come and do the work if we get in trouble. But, here's what I'll do. We're $9 billion in debt. If I come across $300 million, you know what? It's yours. It's going to be 300 times your annual revenue. But as you know, you can always hire help. That's the story we're asked to believe versus, I don't know, I think somebody else is taking a graft cut here. All right, that is actually easier to believe. So the Washington Post story here, I'm sort of scanning to see what other details we might pull out of
worse.
it. But
you read the end of it about who's and I see now where they're getting their money. It's HBC, a Texas investment firm, is now the largest financier of Whitefish.
Okay.
Well, once you got that contract, sure, give them money now.
Oh, well, that's true. I mean, I guess you could get a good loan anywhere where if you say, I just signed a contract for 300 times our usual annual revenue, you could get a loan that way, I would think. Whitefish has a Twitter feed. I did learn this from the article. Let's see. Might as well open that up and see so we can all follow along. They won't be doing a lot of tweeting because they're busy. There's only two guys.
This story makes me think of
Whitefish
the old
Energy.
saying about pigs getting slaughtered. These guys, a lot of times the way these graft things work is the person with the connections teams up with an actual company that can actually do all the work.
Yeah.
And they do a joint bid, and they get to wet their beak a little, and the other company does the work.
Yes.
But these guys, they wanted it all, apparently.
Yeah. Well,
I don't know.
It does remind me of, like I said, of a lot of other contracting situations. And it's at this point is, I think, fairly typical. It's usually the outlier, and it's usually I hear a lot of stories like this because they end up in court and everybody's arrested.
Well, that's actually another part of this story. Puerto Rico actually has a very long tradition of contracts like this ending up being the subject of federal prosecution.
Oh, yeah? Okay.
Yeah. I mean, the same time period I was telling you about before in the late 90s, a number of the Father Rosello's related people, both government officials and donors and whatnot, there was a ton of public corruption trials about it, and that's frankly par for the course. The subsequent governor got indicted and went to trial. He beat at trial. Mm-hmm. Excuse me. So this is not new in that sense.
Oh my!
What is new?
We'll send you a Whitefish urgent care.
Yeah, exactly. I'll give you that contract.
We'll fix it.
What is new is the fact Puerto Rico doesn't have any money, and in essence, the connections, the graft have to come from from Washington. In the past, it was generally local people getting with their local connections, etc. So
All right.
we'll see.
Okay. By the way, the movie I was thinking of, I finally figured it out. Got the name off of the internets. War Dogs was the film I was thinking of. I knew all I could remember was Jonah Hill was in it, and a 2016 film based on the true story of two young men, David Pacuz, I guess is his last name, and Ephraim Diveroli, who won a $300 million contract from the Pentagon to arm America's allies in Afghanistan. The basic line of the story there was they were two guys who just basically, had some business training background and were looking to make a killing on something, and decided for the hell of it to bid in the sort of Wild West marketplace of the permanent global war on terrorism. And they bid on a giant contract for buying ammunition to supply, as it says here, America's allies in Afghanistan. And they basically went on the black market and bought as much ammunition as they could. They ended up buying, I think, like a lot of expired Romanian surplus and Chinese manufactured ammunition, which was totally illegal, apparently, under the contracting rules. And they just relabeled the stuff and sold it to the Pentagon, and I guess everybody went to jail at some point. But
so that's based on a true story, presumably,
yes,
right?
Yeah, right. And it reminds me also of a lot of the stories we heard about contractors in Iraq doing business with the Coalition Provisional Authority and doing things like winning the contract to open up the Baghdad airport again, and just buying rickety old surplus garbage from international airports around the world that were throwing away their the stairs that you bring up to the aircraft to unload it, and repainting the stuff and shipping it over to Iraq, and then making off with shrink wrapped pallets of cash in exchange for all this stuff. So, this is the sort of stuff that happens in government contracting. Somebody's got to do this work. And
well, that was Eric Prince's business model, basically, right?
Yes, and now, of course, shifting into renting his armies to the United Arab Emirates to stage an invasion of Qatar, which we read the other day. Sounds like fun. Essentially, that's it. The government says they want XYZ to happen. They have no idea how to make it happen. They contract out and shift, allegedly, the responsibility to somebody else. Well, now it's not our problem. We hired a contractor. If it doesn't get done, we'll sue them to get the money back. Maybe we'll get it, maybe we won't. And then the guys land a contract. They buy themselves, Ducatis and all sorts of real estate all over the world. And then they realize, I'm in over my head. And the government comes after them to try to recover it. And then it's a race between whether or not they can make off with the money or hide in Abu Dhabi, or can I claim dual citizenship somewhere else and run away from prosecution. And then the government throws their hands up and says, we tried. But they ran away to Russia or Israel or someplace, and now we can't get them anymore.
Yeah,
oh, well.
It's not a news story, this Whitefish story. It's frankly one of the oldest political stories in the world.
We might as well take
Tammany
a look.
Hall was built on this.
Yeah.
And it doesn't, Democrats can do it too. They probably do. Certainly.
Sure, send it to me. I'll do it.
But it's just amazing, though, that it's happening in a fairly high-profile situation that's going to be scrutinized. And that's a lot of money. I mean, yes, for the government of the United States, it's not a lot of money. But for the two guys to get $300 million.
Sure. Right. Well, like this movie. And they likewise were in over their head, and then couldn't believe their luck in getting this much money, and of course squandered lots of it, and in an attempt to keep as much of it as possible, cut corners and cheated. We'll see whether that's the case with these guys. I was a little bit surprised. I think it sets up well in terms of a graft story for everybody involved. I mean, the Trump administration will certainly not hesitate to do something like well, look, the place needed to be fixed, so we got a contract set up for them to fix it. And if they don't fix it, they'll say, brown people. They can't fix
I give them a
anything.
10 out of 10.
Yeah, or as far as the contractors go, those guys get a 10 out of 10. But they hired local people, as we asked them to do. But, brown people, they don't work very well. So it didn't work out, and they'll just blame it on that, not the fact that the two guys in Montana are going to have no idea whatsoever about how to fix that much infrastructure in a place so far and so different from where they live. But I'm sure if it doesn't work out, they can blame it on people on the ground. And the white guys in Montana, they did the best that they could. I guess the other possibility and the other thing that I'm reminded of with contracting situations like this, I don't know what the case is in Montana, and I don't know the guys there, but the Daily Beast has an interesting story on it. Maybe we'll read through a little bit of that. But back in the Iraq and Coalition Provisional Authority days, when nobody had the authority to check into any of the contracting anybody was doing, and we don't have quite the same situation, the same Wild West sort of situation that we did with the CPA, unless you count the fact that this is, who's responsible for finding out whether any of this money is being wasted or grifted away, and the answer is the Jeff Sessions Department of Justice. So go ahead and steal. Just make sure you kick some of it back to Jeff or his friends, and at which point we'll put Cyrus Vance on your case, I guess, and you won't be prosecuted for a mere $10,000 contribution, which out of $300 million is a drop in the bucket. So maybe that's what's going on. But what it reminded me of with the CPA was a lot of, and you mentioned Eric Prince and Blackwater, lots of contracting for security back in the day. And one of the favorite tricks was for companies, and this happened a lot with companies from Alaska in particular, they take advantage of contracting opportunities set aside for women and minority-owned businesses and contract with Native American tribes to do this. In other words, if two guys in Whitefish in an office say, if you give us the $300 million, even if we do an honest job of it, we're just going to go and hire electricians from elsewhere, and it'll get done, and it'll get done right, but, I'll make $1 million in pure profit, and so will my partner, and $298 million will go out to pay line workers. So it's a great opportunity, right? I get $1 million for the genius of making some phone calls. And that's not unusual. That's kind of Wall Street way of operating. Certainly Donald Trump would see nothing whatsoever wrong with saying a $300 million deal got arranged and I made 7 phone calls to do it. That's $1 million to me. Nothing weird about that. The rest of America says, oh my God, that's crazy. But in reality, that really is the way a lot of this contracting is done, including up and up honest contracting gets done that way. So-called honest contracting. So anyway, back in the day with security issues, they a lot of times the wizards who put that sort of stuff together would nominally partner with a Native American tribe and incorporate as something with the tribal name in it. And the deal was, we're a couple of white guys and we'd like to make $1 million, but we're not going to have a great shot at it unless we get this extra angle. We partner with a Native American tribe and we take $3 million off the top. One for me, one for my partner, one for the tribe. And we call it Native American Security Enterprises Incorporated. Or in this case, the one I'm thinking of, Chenega tribe in who knows whether I'm pronouncing that correctly or not. But in Alaska, they made a bundle picking up contracts for stuff like manning the gate at, an Air Force base overseas. You hire a local person to sit there. He's an employee of Chenega Security Incorporated, which, is a bunch of people who never left Alaska, but they got the contract because there's a set aside, which, of course, the Trump administration would never stand for because it hates political correctness so much and quotas, etc. I guess it's a long story. We've been doing this for a long time. And no evidence that that's the case here just yet. But in Montana, that would not be beyond the pale. If the firm was from New Jersey, I'd say, all right, they're going to have a hard time finding a local tribe to work with. Not that there aren't ones. But in Montana, that's an easier thing to do and recognized as a legitimate way of doing business. So I'd be curious to find out whether that's the case.
Yeah, I mean, possibly. But I just want to bring this back to human cost of this graft in this particular situation.
Yes.
At the end of the Washington Post article, it says the governor of Puerto Rico recently said that 95% of the power would be restored on the island by Christmas.
That's a good time for it.
Mansky, who is one of the two employees of Whitefish, said, and I quote from the story, "I don't know where he got that and what information he was using."
Well, that's at least honest, I guess.
Without doing a full assessment countrywide. Countrywide, first of all, it's not a country.
Oh, wow.
It's a territory of the United States, but fine. I couldn't fathom how many months. If it's going to be 2 months, 3 months, 5 months, we've been focused in the small areas that we've been working. You know why he's been focused in the small areas he's been working? Because the check hasn't cleared. He's got $4 million.
Oh, well, yeah.
He's going to do $4 million worth of hiring.
Yes. And that's not, that's not crazy. It is
crazy because you can hire a giant company that can actually wait for the money and won't wait for it to hit the bank account before they start doing the work.
Yeah. No, I mean, at his level, it's not crazy for him to say.
Oh, no. I mean, for him, show me the money. Right. I agree, but that means he shouldn't be doing the project.
Yes. Right. You do
besides everything else about lack of experience, the ridiculousness of a two-person company getting this project in the first place. It's just not the type of project that should be done this way.
Yeah.
You need someone who's got the resources to go ahead and do it with the promise that they will get paid. These guys apparently said, I got the contract, but I'm not going to do the work till I get the money.
Yeah.
Well, that's not going to be great, and I wonder how the governor of Puerto Rico is going to look in Christmas when he still has 80% no power.
Yes, all the Christmas lights will not be on. That will be bad news.
Well, Christmas is a big holiday. People love the Christmas lights in Puerto Rico. It extends to Three Kings up to January 6th. It's like a 25-day holiday, really.
Wow.
And it's obviously horrible. And again, what's going to end up happening, which is amazing that Republicans are being so short-sighted, you're going to end up with 300,000 or 400,000 Puerto Ricans moving to Florida, and the majority will vote Democrat, which is good for us, but it's terrible for the island, and it's just unbelievable.
Well, maybe they'll get contracts. They can move back.
I appreciate you taking this hour to talk about this story with me. It's one that obviously I'm interested in. But I see that Bob Corker's making all sorts of news.
Oh, okay, yes. And
I assume you'll probably dedicate your second hour to him saying, I think the headline is, he said he will, would he support Trump again? He said, no, he would not. Which, of course not. He says Trump has a lack of desire to be competent. That could be. He also lacks the ability to be competent.
That may be true.
I think both things. He may, even if he wanted it, he couldn't. I mean, let's be honest.
Lots coming out here. Corker also quoted by Axios as saying, "We have young people who, for the first time, are watching a president stating absolute non-truths nonstop." It's exciting to watch the kids.
Fact check. That's true.
I think so. Well, certainly, it's very different. No doubt about that. I don't know how much time we'll spend on Corker, but I guess if he keeps talking, we'll go back to it.
If he keeps saying stuff. Anyway, the funny thing, of course, is the punchline of all that is, and I know you're about to go to the break, is that Trump is going up to Capitol Hill today to have a good feeling lunch with the senators.
Yes.
There'll be a lot of good feeling in that room, huh?
Yeah, I know. That's gonna be pretty good. I saw a very funny tweet, and I think I'll fact check this one, which I'm going to retweet it for everybody here, and I think I'll even put it aside for inclusion in the roundup. Fact check: whoever did this is a damn genius, and I think it's largely true. Enzo Moret says here, and this is it's a compilation of 4 photos of Trump giving speeches or discussing things in the Oval Office and in the cabinet room, and of course the hanging portraits of the presidents in the background have been photoshopped in such a way that, let's say, George Washington is scowling and giving him the finger behind his back. Andrew Jackson is burying his head in his hands. Thomas Jefferson making various lewd gesture with his hand. And who's that in the background? Is that one Madison, perhaps, putting the gun fingers up to his head? It's pretty funny. And well, I agree, it's genius. Time now, though, for our genius break music. Thanks, Armando.
All right.
You probably have to get to some work at some point.
I do. I got to run. Thanks
All right.
for letting me talk about that.
Thanks for adding to our discussion. We'll talk to you again, I'm sure, later in the week. Time now, though, as I mentioned, for a second of our breaks for station identification, so that everybody can tell you exactly who you're listening to. I'll be back to tell you who you're listening to if you're not listening to a local radio station after this. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Of course, we're all over the place, including WRFZ in Rochester. As a matter of fact, I got some nice supportive tweets that I think were about the show the other day from a Twitter follower in Rochester, and I felt like asking him, hey, do you know that we're on the radio in your town? And then I thought it might be foolish. Maybe that's why the guy was following me, and I never followed up, and I just wondered about that. Does anybody know how I can search my entire follower list for people who say they're from Rochester in their profiles? There's probably an easy way of doing that. I would love to know whether we're adding to the following, and who's finding the show on local radio versus following the show because they're already readers of Daily Kos, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know what I would do with that information, but I don't know. I feel like it might be interesting to know. Anyway, just to follow up on everything, let's see, a couple of comments that have come in the last couple of minutes. I shared with a lot of you on Twitter. If you're listening live, Albert Titus's photo here. Whitefish Energy, ready for any emergency. A picture of 3 different sized extension cords. And that's basically what they seem to be bringing to the table. Although I must say, the CEO, what was it? Techman something or other of Whitefish Energy sounds, intellectually competent, and he's saying things that make me think he's non-crazy, except for the idea of possibly biting off way, way more than he can chew in all of this. I don't know. Anyway, I kind of like what I'm hearing from him in terms of, we're not sure how long this thing is going to take, and we think we could handle it, and that's really just about it. Let's see. Michael Musson also commenting here, we'll know how Trump is feeling over this spat with Corker if the White House calls in more trucks for Trump to play with, and that would probably be a good indication. Let's see. Lots of other things going on here, but I actually think we might stay on the Puerto Rico story just so I can dig into this Daily Beast piece as I continue to threaten. Ken Klippenstein wrote this piece here, $300 million Puerto Rico recovery contract linked to Trump donor. Let's see if we can get into some juicy bits here. Puerto Rico has, of course, agreed to pay this reported $300 million, although Armando reminds us it's not really Puerto Rico paying it. They've agreed to pay it, but that they're just a pass-through, I guess. A huge tax write-off under the new tax reform plan for them to pass on this federal $300 million for the restoration of the power grid. The payment, of course, to a tiny utility company that's primarily financed by a private equity firm, there we are, founded and run by a man who contributed large sums of money to President Trump, an investigation conducted by the Daily Beast has found. Whitefish Energy Holdings, that's the way we ought to think of them, not as their friendly-looking Twitter account that's called Whitefish Energy. That just sort of makes it sound like, yeah, we actually do things. As opposed to Whitefish Energy Holdings, which means we hold stuff for people who do things and then take all their money. Whitefish Energy Holdings, which has a reported staff of only 2 full-time employees, blah, 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 appears ill-equipped to handle the daunting task of restoring electricity to more than 3 million residents. Much larger utilities are more commonly used following natural disasters on the scale of Hurricane Maria. The private equity firm that finances Whitefish, HBC Investments, was founded by Joe Colonnetta, who serves as its general partner. Federal Elections Commission data compiled by the Daily Beast, well, compiled by the Federal Election Commission and read by the Daily Beast, but okay, shows Colonnetta has contributed $20,000 to the Trump Victory PAC during the general election, $27,000 to Trump's primary election campaign, then the maximum amount permitted, $27,000 to Trump's general election campaign, also the max, and a total of $30,700 to the Republican National Committee in 2016 alone. So what's that? 20, 40, 60, 70, 80, 90, and then another 7,000 there, 90. So, good 100,000 plus to the Trump election campaigns and the RNC once he got the nomination. So that's a pretty significant chunk of money. Not for these guys, but it just goes to show that it's still one of the best payoff deals you can make is investing in politics. $100,000 in, $300 million out. He's not going to get the whole $300 million, though. But okay. Joe Colonnetta is not the only Republican connection to the controversial Whitefish contract. On Monday, the Washington Post reported that Whitefish CEO Andy Techmansky is friends with Trump administration Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke. Moreover, Whitefish is located in Zinke's hometown of Whitefish, Montana. Luis Vega Ramos, member of the Puerto Rico House of Representatives, told the Daily Beast, Whitefish's most important expertise or asset seems to have been having the U.S. Secretary of the Interior, Ryan Zinke, as their former congressman and current ally, and having the wisdom to retain the services of key people close to the governor of Puerto Rico. Maybe so. Zinke isn't the only member of the Trump administration with a connection to the Whitefish contract. In addition to the Colonnetta's contributions to Trump's presidential campaign, Kimberly Colonnetta's Facebook page contains a photo of her with Ben Carson, Trump's Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, because there's so much urban development going on in Montana. I'm sure there are places, right? There's housing anyway. Another photo appears to show Kimberly Colonnetta with Trump's Secretary of State Rex Everything Tillerson. Both photos were posted the week of Trump's inauguration. So they were here palling around. Don't know whether they also contributed to the inauguration, but they certainly bought big money tickets somewhere along the line. Whitefish seems to be nothing more than a glorified middleman to get the real providers of the services, with which PREPA could have contracted directly, Vega Ramos said. It is a cozy sweetheart deal in which Whitefish gets the gratuity for subcontracting to the actual providers. That's going to be true. It's going to be true for somebody. It's true that they could contract with them directly, and that probably a state-owned power utility was in a good position to do something like that. But okay. It isn't out of the ordinary for contracting. That just might be a general problem with federal government contracting that needs looking at, but isn't likely to get anything done about that anytime soon. Federal agencies like FEMA and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which are ordinarily responsible for evaluating contracts for disaster response, have attempted to distance themselves from the Whitefish contract. FEMA didn't respond to the Daily Beast request for comment. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, on the other hand, told the Daily Beast that it does not comment on contracting decisions made by external organizations that do not involve U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So, okay. No comment from FEMA, and a comment that means no comment from the Army Corps of Engineers. However, PREPA spokesman Carlos Monroig Aceveda told Weather.com, and who else would he tell, really, that its contracts, quote, are evaluated and awarded by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in coordination with FEMA, which disperses the money. Okay, then, what's the holdup for getting a comment from the Army Corps? Vega Ramos said it is reprehensible that shameless profiteering is going on literally on the back of a devastated people the devastated people of Puerto Rico. It is beyond contempt, and the people some people anyway, should answer for it. The Colonnada's contributions to the Republican Party precede the Trump administration, by the way. For example, in October of 2011, Joe Colonnetta distributed $30,000 to the RNC. In 2008, $26,200 to the RNC and $28,500 to the McCain Victory Committee. During both years, Kimberly Colonnetta also contributed thousands to various Republican campaigns. Not a surprise, obviously. Big-time venture capital or, private equity vultures are going to be Republican, and they're going to donate money in an attempt to steer government contracts their way. Joe Colonetta's relationship with the GOP is not limited to his contributions. He's a prominent figure in Texas Republican politics. According to HBC's website, in 2013, then Texas Governor Rick Perry appointed Colonnetta as a trustee for the retirement system of Texas. In 2015, Texas Governor Greg Abbott appointed Colonnetta to serve as chairman of the investment committee, also at the retirement system of Texas. And at the same time, Texas Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick appointed Colonnetta to his policy advisory committee. More stories to come, I would think, from that. Daily Beast hopefully will follow up. In all likelihood, I mean, the reason for appointing a guy like this to the retirement system of Texas is because the retirement system of Texas is sitting on a pile of billions of dollars in cash, and this is a guy in a private equity, in the private equity line of work. He wants access to that cash, or wants to be a vote on the board directing how the retirement system of Texas invests its money. And I would not be surprised if, by some strange magic, the retirement system of Texas began investing in investments in which HBC was already invested, and he was looking to use public money like that, public institutional money, to either shore up or even bail out his own investments. Even if they weren't in bad shape, it always helps to have another, $100 million get plunked down by somebody else, somebody beyond reproach, like a public statewide retirement system who nobody blames them for any fishy dealings. It's just that, if you look behind the curtain, you'll see who makes those decisions. Well, it's a bunch of private equity vulture capitalists who are appointed by, very often by Republican governors. And in this case, I assume it happens occasionally with Democrats too. But how do you get appointed to a board like that? You give lots and lots of money to governors when they run for re-election or when they run for their initial election. They owe you a favor. You ask them, what do these people want? Well, I want to be appointed to this board. That's fine. Hardly anybody knows that this board even exists. Nobody checks the news about who's getting appointed to these things. But somebody's got to be on this board. Absolutely, I'll give you that. You want to be, Secretary of State? Well, that's a tougher call. You want to be on a board that nobody cares about? You bet. No problem. Why do you want to be on that board? Because you make decisions about where huge chunks of government money go. And if they go to your pet projects, fantastic. You make money. Even better, if you are in private equity and you have bought something, some investment, even if it's a great investment, or, it doesn't really matter, great investment or it's a total dog, right? Either way, you're motivated to vote to put $100 million of this public money into that investment, either so that you, on your private side of the deal, can get out, or you make more money because the investment drives the share prices up of the company that you bought into for cheap when it was a dog, and then you get out, or at least partially out. It's a fairly common operation. I remember it wasn't that long ago on the show. Well, actually, it was a long time ago on the show, several years ago, when we were talking about, do you remember, there was this dumb movement on, and I think it was based in Texas, right? The idea that Texas wanted its own gold reserves or something like that, or that they wanted, or there was a movement on, let's move some portion of Fort Knox's gold reserves. I forget exactly how the whole thing went, to Texas. And, but I think they had their own gold reserves, and they wanted to relocate them, and gee whiz, if they weren't being relocated to, places that or locations that the people making these decisions had a financial interest in. They could lease them to the government. Anyway, there's a whole bunch of old stories coming to mind in this Puerto Rico thing, probably because it's such an old game. But everything old is new again, I guess. I'm sure we'll be back on this story after not that long. Okay, so there's more going on than just the grift and graft in Puerto Rico. But it dominated the headlines today. Lots of other things to check in on, including some very interesting Trump-Russia developments and a few other things too. Let's see. Where to start? I don't know. We'll just jump into the middle of pocket here. An interesting piece in the Atlantic. Julia Ioffe, whose name comes up now and again on our show, had kind of an interesting piece here. This occurred to me as we were reading yesterday's round of Trump-Russia stories. As I was reading the stories of Russian involvement in, not necessarily directly in Trump's campaign, but as we were reading J.J. McNabb's long tweet storm about the history of how she saw several years worth of Russian and even Iranian meddling in American politics at pressure points in American politics, it occurred to me this makes a certain amount of sense. As an enemy, as a weapon against your enemies, to divide them, that always makes a certain amount of sense. And it wouldn't have surprised me if back in the Soviet Russian days, whether they didn't immediately recognize that there really were usable fault lines to meddle in American politics, especially, I'm sure, during the civil rights movement. I'm sure it occurred to Soviet Russians, some of whom were pretty notorious racists probably in their own right, but some of the really super dedicated Marxist communist types probably in the day thought, well, in America, their population of people of color provide the bulk of the physical labor that runs the country. And of course, if you study your American history, and you and I have also all studied that, of course, but if you're a Soviet Russian who has studied your American history, they would be aware, of course, of the history of slavery. And they would likely say, to a dedicated Marxist, Leninist, communist, to add a couple of extra ists to that phrase, they would likely be very, very intrigued by this and say, it shows the basic hollowness and corruption of American society that they continued to deny that slaves built their country. I mean, slaves built Russia too, but they were a little more explicit in their Bolshevik revolution and saying, yeah, we know who built this country. That's the point. That's why we're executing the aristocratic class. The Americans never had the guts or wisdom, in their view, I'm sure, to go ahead and do that. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't prod them to do so now. They would probably have been very interested, even in a very cynical way, in underwriting and prodding along the civil rights movement in the hopes, not so much necessarily, although I'm certain that, like I said, some dedicated communists would have been interested in saying, in the hopes of freeing and empowering enslaved and basically still enslaved minorities in anywhere but inside America, and they could probably find common cause with the less dedicated communists, but more interested in realpolitik, I guess, undermining of America. If you couldn't necessarily find a political alliance with not hardline communists, but hardline authoritarians in Soviet Russia, they probably could find common cause in saying soft-hearted but hardcore communists could find common cause with hard-hearted, nominal communist authoritarians in saying, let's pull off this project. Let's do what we can to meddle in American politics and prod along the civil rights movement as a way of shaming the American establishment and maybe undermining it and turning the bulk of the American electorate against it. Why wouldn't we do that? And they probably had no problem putting together that coalition in Soviet Russia, which, of course, brings us back to the very weird position of having to acknowledge that maybe the John Birchers had something there when they said the civil rights movement was, in fact, connected to and underwritten by Soviet communism. Well, I don't think we could necessarily pin the whole thing on them, but I'm certain that Soviet communists had some, at least cynical, interest in what was going on there. On the other hand, why is it difficult to believe that millions upon millions of previously oppressed people of color would be dissatisfied with that situation and be willing to do almost anything, at least in the context, and would be more than happy to do things in the context of non-violent non-cooperation, as advocated by Martin Luther King, to change that situation. In other words, it was a complex situation, and the Russians likely knew it. So it was entirely possible and entirely plausible that Russians could have been interested in that kind of manipulation for a long time. And the internet and interconnectivity of the global communities only made that easier. And I guess it turns out that that's the case. The piece here from Julie Ioffe is about the history of Russian involvement in America's race wars. From propaganda posters to Facebook ads, 80 plus years of Russian meddling is the subject of her story. According to a spate of recent reports, she begins accounts tied to the St. Petersburg-based internet research agency, a Russian troll factory, used social media and Google during the 2016 electoral campaign to deepen political and racial tensions in the United States. The trolls, according to an interview with the Russian TV network TV Rain, were directed to focus their tweets and comments on socially divisive issues like guns. But another consistent theme have been Russian trolls focusing on issues of race. Some of the Russian ads placed on Facebook apparently targeted Ferguson and Baltimore, which were rocked by protests after police killings of unarmed black men. Another showed a black woman firing a rifle. Other ads played on fears of illegal immigrants and Muslims and groups like Black Lives Matter. Except for the technology used, however, these tactics are not exactly new. They are natural outgrowths of a central component of covert influence campaigns like the one Russia launched against the United States during the 2016 election: make discord louder, divide and conquer. Covert influence campaigns don't create divisions on the ground, they amplify divisions on the ground, says Michael Hayden, who ran the NSA under Presidents Bill Clinton and George W. Bush, and then became CIA director. Normally not a favorite source for Julie Ioffe, I am sure, but an admission against interest, perhaps, in this case, and so she admits it to the article. During the Cold War, the Kremlin similarly sought to plant fake news and foment discontent, but was limited by the low-tech methods available at the time. Before, the Soviets would plant information in Indian papers and hope it would get picked up by our papers, says John Cipher, who ran the CIA's Russia desk during the George W. Bush first administration of George W. Bush. The Soviets planted misinformation about the AIDS epidemic as a Pentagon creation, according to Cipher, as well as the very concept of a nuclear winter. Now, because of the technology, you can jump right in, Cipher says. Neither is playing on racial tensions inside the United States a new Russian tactic. In fact, it predates even the Cold War. In 1932, for instance, Dmitry Moore, the Soviet Union's most famous propaganda poster artist, created a poster that cried, "Freedom to the prisoners of Scottsboro." It was a reference to the Scottsboro Boys, 9 black teenagers who were falsely accused of raping 2 white women in Alabama, and then repeatedly, wrongly, convicted by all-white Southern juries. The case became a symbol of the injustices of the Jim Crow South, and the young Soviet state milked it for all the propagandistic value it could. It was part of a plan put in place in 1928 by the Comintern, the Communist International, whose mission was to spread the communist revolution around the world. The plan initially called for recruiting Southern blacks and pushing for self-determination in the Black Belt. By 1930, the Comintern had escalated the aims of its covert mission and decided to work toward establishing a separate black state in the South, which would provide it with a beachhead for spreading the revolution to North America. The Soviets also exploited the oppression of Southern blacks for their own economic benefit. It was the height of the Great Depression, and the Soviet Union was positioning itself not only as a workers' utopia, but as a racial utopia as well, where ethnic, national, and religious divisions didn't exist. Of course, I suppose at some point we should point out that these divisions didn't exist because they stomped them out mercilessly. Maybe, I'm sure they thought for the betterment of everyone, but there was very little ethnic, national, and religious division because basically acknowledging those divisions was illegal, though of course you always had the innate and inherent prejudices of the various ethnic groups. And I mean, somebody shows up, and just because you're not allowed to practice religion openly and not allowed to speak your own ethnic language doesn't mean you won't be recognized as a member of an ethnic minority when you show your face someplace, and people will treat you differently because that's the way people, unfortunately, are raised back then and today. But at any rate, it's not like it was, in fact, such a utopia. It was simply enforced for sometimes cynical reasons and with, I'm sure, unevenness across the board on all counts. Anyway, no reason to get sidetracked with all of that. I think you all understand it pretty well. In addition to luring thousands of white American workers, it brought over African American workers and sharecroppers with the promise of the freedom to work and live unburdened by the violent restrictions of Jim Crow. In return, they would help the Soviets build their fledgling cotton industry in Central Asia. Several hundred answered the call. That's not a generalized answering of the call necessarily, but the idea of uprooting from the rural American South and relocating to Central Asia was probably a pretty daunting one, but several hundred tried it anyway. And though many eventually went back or died in the Gulag, one of the other occupational hazards of adopting the Soviet communist model as your own, some of their descendants remain in Russia. There's got to be some, right? One of Russia's best-known television hosts, for instance, is Yelena Kanga, the granddaughter of Oliver Golden, an agronomist from Tuskegee University who moved with his communist Jewish-American wife, oh my gosh, Richard Spencer's bells just went off, to Uzbekistan to develop the cotton industry there. It's a fascinating history. The beginning of the Cold War coincided with the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement, and the two became intertwined in weird ways, as we mentioned. Of course, the other side of the coin being the John Birchers in all of this. The two became intertwined both in how the Soviets used the racial strife and how the Cold War propelled the cause of civil rights forward. And, of course, exactly what I was just mentioning, engendering suspicion among ultra-right-wing, ultra-wacko conservatives. Coming up on our next break, once again, of course, we'll cram in another 30 seconds or so over the music here. Early on in the Cold War, there was a recognition that the U.S. couldn't lead the world if it was seen as repressing people of color, says Mary Dudziak, a legal historian at Emory, whose book Cold War Civil Rights is the seminal work on the topic. We'll continue with this fascinating article and more thoughts on it after this break for station identification. Welcome back once again to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We're going to continue with this kind of fascinating historical background that Julia Ioffe has put together for The Atlantic. When we left off, we had just read about the intertwining of the civil rights movement and the Cold War in various interesting and, I don't know, now in hindsight, I guess you could say rather predictable ways, although it did get more and more complicated. We also mentioned the quote from Mary Dudziak, legal historian at Emory, whose book Cold War Civil Rights, as they say here, is the seminal work on the topic. Early on in the Cold War, there was a recognition that the U.S. couldn't lead the world if it was seen as repressing people of color. Certainly, it's a dominant theme among the left still these days. And like I guess I should caution, yeah, they come to it honestly and come to it naturally. I'm sure that there are some people somewhere, just as some people decided, yes, I absolutely will move to Central Asia and try to start a cotton industry for the Soviet Union, because why not? They'll treat me great, and then they ended up in the gulag. Or maybe they didn't. Maybe they ended up as a TV presenter later on. But there are certainly people who come to it honestly, and certainly some others who, probably others who accept pay for it, but think, well, that's pretty honest. I'm going to start a cotton industry. Why wouldn't I get paid for that? Anyway, it's a natural place for left-leaning folks to come down and say, we've been raised honestly on the promise of America. That equality is supposed to be our chief aim. And where we fall short of that, we will say so, and we will work to change that. That doesn't make you a Soviet communist agent. That makes you somebody who believes in the promise of a free America. Makes you a huge patriot. Of course, there are probably also people who say, wouldn't mind advocating for things like this because they sound fair in exchange for some pay, too. And that's not even a bad thing. You're supposed to get paid for what you do. I wondered about this, and it came to mind as earlier in the article when they were saying that current Russian agitation and propaganda programs included work on the fracture point of guns. And it occurred to me, well, immediately somebody could obviously have a look at my Twitter account and say, well, he's obviously being paid by the Russians to talk so much about gun fail, except I only wish, because nobody's paying me anything for doing anything about gun fail. That's not a profit-making or profitable pursuit. It's purely, hey, I got interested in this and I started to do it and I got in way over my head and now I have to keep doing it because I feel bad if I'm not, because people are getting killed and I'm not saying anything. That's all there is to it. I'm not underwritten by anybody. Nobody pays me. The gun groups don't pay. The anti-gun groups don't pay. Frankly, both of them should. There's nothing, nobody pays anything for gun fail. Let me assure you of that, except I guess in the sense that the same stipend of payment that comes from Daily Kos covers everything. They basically say, I don't know, we would like to have you continue to do the gun fail series, yes, and we'd like to make it possible for you to continue to do Daily Kos Radio. Here's a minimal payment to keep you somewhat affiliated here. And go to town. I guess for the amount of money, we'll just say you do what you do, and that will be great. Keep doing it, and we're happy to keep printing it. That's basically it. But there's no sponsorship, no Brady Center money, no Every Town for Gun Sense money, no Bloomberg money, no, what's the other guy, George Soros money, no nothing. The money is yours. To the extent that there's money coming in, it's the money coming in through Patreon and Square Cash, and occasionally still PayPal. That's it. You own it. It's yours. You're the big donor that's making all the stuff happen. So I guess you could be pretty proud of that. I could be too, but it's not sending the kids to college. But anyway, I digress. If anybody wants me to move to Central Asia and do this, the answer will be no. The kids are happy here, and they have friends here, and, I have to wait for them to graduate college, etc., before taking off for Central Asia to try to start the podcasting community there. And I don't want to do it because I'm just going to end up in the gulag, and who likes that? Nobody. So nobody wins under this scenario. Anyway, Julia Ioffe was telling you something that was really interesting. I'll go back to her. She continues in her article, when, in September of 1957, the Arkansas governor Orville Faubus deployed the National Guard to keep 9 black students from integrating the Central High School in Little Rock. The standoff was covered by newspapers around the world, many of which noted the discrepancy between the values America expressed and hoped to spread around the world and how it implemented them at home. The Soviets again took full advantage of the opportunity. Oh my goodness, it's time for some Russian pronunciation. Komsomolskaya Pravda, the newspaper of the Communist Youth Organization in the USSR. That pronunciation went relatively smoothly, maybe because I've been paid by Russians. Ran a sensational story, they did, complete with photographs about the conflict under the headline, "Troops Advance Against Children!" Exclamation point. Izvestia, the second main Soviet daily, also extensively covered the Little Rock crisis, noting at one point that right now, behind the facade of the so-called American democracy, a tragedy is unfolding which cannot but arouse ire and indignation in the heart of every honest man. Yeah, that's some flowery stuff. The story went on. The patrons of Governor Faubus, who dream of nooses and dynamite for persons with different colored skins, advocates of hooliganism who throw rocks at defenseless Negro children, these gentlemen have the audacity to talk about, quote, democracy, and speak as supporters of, quote, freedom. Well, they have us there, don't they? Of course, it's, as we said, worth pointing out that they weren't particularly great to their own ethnic minorities over there, but they're not wrong. In fact, the article then continued, in fact, it is impossible to imagine a greater insult to democracy and freedom than an American diplomat's speech from the tribunal of the U.S. General Assembly. What? U.S. General Assembly? Is that what they thought Congress was called? A speech in which Washington was pictured as the, quote, champion of the rights of the Hungarian people. Well, they got to get as much as they give, I think, on that one. The point then, as it was in 2016, was to discredit the American system, to keep the Soviets and later Russians loyal to their own system instead of hungering for Western-style democracy, but it was also used in Soviet propaganda around the world for a similar purpose. This is a principal Soviet propaganda theme, says Dudziak of the Soviet messaging at the time. What's described as communist propaganda that circulated in India overplays the story sometimes, but also very maudlin stories about things that actually happened. Sometimes in Pravda, all they needed to do was reprint something that appeared in Time magazine. Just the facts themselves would inflame international opinion. On top of that, the Soviets would push the envelope. This came at a critical time for the United States. After World War II, the U.S. was a new global power locked in an ideological struggle with the Soviet Union. As the United States tried to convince countries to join its sphere by taking up democracy and liberal values, the U.S. government was competing with the Soviets in parts of the world where images of white cops turning fire hoses and attack dogs on black protesters did not sit well, especially considering that this was coinciding with the wave of African countries declaring independence from white colonial rulers. Here at the United Nations, I can see clearly the harm that the riots in Little Rock are doing to our foreign relations. Henry Cabot Lodge, then the U.S. ambassador to the UN, wrote to President Eisenhower in 1957. More than two-thirds of the world is non-white, and the reactions of representatives of these people is easy to see. I suspect that we lost several votes on the Chinese communist item because of Little Rock. The Russian objective then was to disrupt U.S. international relations and undermine U.S. power in the world, and undermine the appeal of U.S. democracy to other countries, says Dudziak, and Lodge was reflecting a central concern at the State Department at the time. Soviet propaganda was working. American diplomats were reporting back both their chagrin and the difficulty of preaching democracy when images of the violence around the civil rights movement was reported all over the world and amplified by Soviet or communist propaganda. On a trip to Latin America, then Vice President Richard Nixon and his wife were met with protesters chanting, "Little Rock, Little Rock." Secretary of State John Foster Dulles complained that this situation was ruining our foreign policy. The effect of this in Asia and Africa will be worse for us than Hungary was for the Russians. Hungary comes up again. Ultimately, he prevailed on Eisenhower to insert a passage into his national address on Little Rock that directly addressed the discrepancy that Soviet propaganda was highlighting and spinning as American hypocrisy. Whenever the Soviet Union was criticized for its human rights abuses, the rebuttal became, "And you lynch Negroes." And we did. And they were right. And also, that's classic whataboutism. But okay. Oh, look, that appears in the next paragraph. See, these writers, they're on the ball. I don't give them enough time. But I guess we're on the same page. Moscow never abandoned these tactics, which became known as whataboutism even after the Soviet Union collapsed. Well, that's because it's an American term, whataboutism. It's English, so it doesn't really matter what the governmental structure of Russia is. It's going to remain known as whataboutism because that's how you say it in English. Russian propaganda outlets like Russia Today, now known as RT, have always focused on domestic strife in the United States, be it homelessness or Occupy Wall Street or the Ferguson protests, or in my day when I appeared on there, impeachment of George W. Bush, etc. The Facebook ads focusing on divisive issues like Black Lives Matter are just another page from the old Soviet handbook. The difference this time is that the Russians got better at penetrating the American discussions on these fraught subjects. They became a more effective bellows, amplifying the fire Americans built. Good news, though, is that America can do things to disarm the propaganda. In the 1950s and 1960s, for example, this was one of the reasons that American presidents pushed through various civil rights victories, culminating in the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. This time, Americans can stop blaming the Russians and look at ourselves for what we do to fan the flames to a far greater extent than the Russians could ever do. If there's anyone to blame, it's us, says Cipher. If we accept the stoking, it's our fault. Well, that is an interesting point and an interesting conclusion to draw from that. I know there are lots of people who have urged that for a long time, and it's true, and it absolutely has to be a part of our confrontation of this prodding. But on the other hand, we could also do better at recognizing where the prodding is coming from. And in our own version of whataboutism, you can remind yourself, I think, it's not unfair to do so, that this isn't necessarily being offered as constructive criticism from the Russians. It could be taken that way, and it's certainly a good reminder every once in a while of where we fail and how we must do better. And the better we do, the less effective that Russian propaganda is going to be. But we also probably ought to and would do well to recognize that, it should fall to us to do our own self-criticism, and we don't necessarily need it coming from outside. Of course, the Russians know it's most effective, by the way, if it looks like it's coming from the inside. They designed their propaganda to look like it was coming from Americans for a reason. They know that if it's clear that it's coming from Russians, we can temper how we accept that criticism, or we can dismiss it entirely. That's true, and that's one of the dangers. But, it's part of the reality is that Americans should distinguish between our own criticism of ourselves and the criticism we receive from abroad, in that, I guess, in evaluating the veracity of that criticism, some part of it is going to have to be, well, there's some serious self-interest going on here, and it's not necessarily that they are dedicated to the proposition of securing human rights internationally for people everywhere based on their principles or their ideas of equality and freedom and non-oppression, but rather they're more interested in making sure that the American government can't do anything, including addressing the social issues and social fractures here that create and perpetuate inequality and injustice. I don't think they actually want us to solve those problems. They simply want us to remain wrapped up in them. And so maybe, for instance, though you could take the criticism that this problem exists, you might not necessarily be inclined to accept their proposed solutions, if there are any offered, for those problems. Those solutions, I think, have to come from within. Unless, of course, like, say, Donald Trump, you're willing to simply sign over control of the American government to the Russians in the hopes that they'll work their magic, that they really aren't bringing these problems up as a cynical ploy, but because they have plans for building an American and worldwide utopia along with their own Russian utopia. But I don't think anybody believes that's the case. Sure, there's a little bit of whataboutism there, but the whataboutism isn't necessarily invalid given that there are ultra-nationalist elements close to the leadership of the Russian government who, for instance, want to see gay people exterminated around the world. Are we going to accept that and say, sure, it's part of, an egalitarianism that dedicated Russian human rights activists who happen to be connected with the Russian government are hoping to spread around the world? I hope that there's no one that believes that, but I suppose there's probably someone somewhere that does. And maybe there's even a dedicated human rights activist inside Russia somewhere who's managed to avoid being purged by Putin who really believes that. But I don't think that's the general thrust of what they're up to over there. And we ought to be aware of where our criticism comes from and evaluate it accordingly. Anyway, I thought a very interesting look at the very long history of Russian involvement. There is another angle out there, by the way, at least two, that I think need to be put on the record, and we only have about 15 minutes or less to do so. Another example of infiltration of sorts along racial and ethnic fracture lines by the Russians. And again, probably not because the Russians are ultimately interested in establishing the rights and equality of this next targeted ethnic group, but because they found more ability to create problems for American domestic and foreign policy. BuzzFeed News, Ryan Brooks reporting this one, how Russians attempted to use Instagram to influence Native Americans. Yeah, that happened too, and of course you probably could have guessed it. And of course that only helps the ultra-right here, well, in addition to many other things, helps the ultra-right here in America justify their view of Native American activists who have legitimate beefs with American policy of all sorts. It helps them dismiss Native American activists as foreign-influenced agitators and or communists themselves, even though the Russians haven't been communist for some time now. The protests against the Dakota Access Pipeline in Cannonball, North Dakota, were sacred for the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, but for Russian trolls, the protests were another opportunity to sow discord in America. One of a series of social movements from Black Lives Matter activism to pro-Trump populism on which the trolls appear to have seized. Their own internal version of whataboutism is both sidesism, I guess, over in the Internet Research Agency. They didn't care which side they were working with so long as discord was sowed, and that's why it's important to recognize what's domestic criticism and what is Russian-driven trolling criticism. And there's a difference there too. Criticism and trolling, two different things. Criticism, presumably constructive criticism, seeks solutions. Trolling seeks discord. And you need to be able to temper that out, take away the valid criticism that exists as the kernel of truth at the center of the trolling, and dismiss the rest of it. An Instagram account called @Native_Americans_United_, 3 underscores there, shared images related to Native American social and political issues, including the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline, the flashpoint for activists from all over the country, but especially Native Americans. RBC, a Russian outlet, identified that account as one of 180 connected to a Russian troll farm intent on exploiting existing divisions and social movements in the United States based on a major investigation into the operations of Russia's Internet Research Agency. Again, the RBC piece we've been talking about for about a week. So far, the accounts uncovered by RBC center around highly visible tension points in American politics, protests against police violence, protests against pipelines that have become a flashpoint between conservatives and progressives, and memes popular with the pro-Trump right. And by the way, here we might as well throw in that, of course, most of the money fueling the Russian oligarchy comes from oil and natural gas exploitation. And I suppose the added bonus to agitating along lines of the Dakota pipeline is if Canadian, American, North American interests are disrupted and the pipeline isn't built, I suppose more of the world market available to the Russians, it pays for itself. This is one of those wars that actually pays for itself. Pay Russian trolls to help pipeline activists or anti-pipeline activists prevent the construction, and I'm for that. I am against the construction. Generally speaking, I think it's a disaster, but that only plays into the Russian oil and gas interest as well. And I know that to be the case, and I accept that as one of the costs of, saving our part of the planet anyway. But, they're going to laugh all the way to the bank, I'm sure, but that's going to happen. They're going to be making their way to the bank regardless over there, whether it's legitimately done or otherwise. I'm not going to be able to get in the way of the Russian mob going to the bank and laughing on the way there. Besides which, if I don't laugh, they'll just kill me and take whatever's in my wallet, and then they'll laugh on the way to the bank. Anyway, so far, the accounts uncovered by the RPC report center around highly visible tension points, as I mentioned. These accounts are believed to include a fake Tennessee GOP Twitter account, remember 10GOP, and payments to black activists to organize protests or hold self-defense classes. This, meanwhile, would be the first instance of Russians targeting Native Americans. RBC reported, well, at least over the internet anyway. If Julia Ioffe is right, they've probably been doing that for quite some time in analog settings. RBC reported that at least 33,000 people followed the Native Americans United account. A post from that account reads, "If an oil company destroyed these sacred burial grounds, Americans would lose their minds." Plastered over, you probably guessed it by now, an image of a U.S. military cemetery. I don't know whether it's Arlington or not. I haven't seen the ad. But when an oil company destroys Native American sacred burial grounds, no one says a word. Valid point. And it does look to be Arlington, as a matter of fact, from the photo. Another account, Native Americans United with only 2 underscores, no third underscore at the end here, discovered by BuzzFeed News, also shared political posts on Instagram using the same watermark as Native Americans United with 3 underscores. Dear racists in America, your car is Japanese, your beer is German, your electronics are Taiwanese, your fashion is French. Your fries are French anyway. Your oil is Saudi Arabian. Your vodka is Russian, if you're lucky. And never forget, the land you live on is mine, reads one of the posts from Native Americans United that was reshared on Facebook. And also, not an invalid point at that. Both Instagram accounts are now suspended. A Facebook official told BuzzFeed News that they aren't confirming any accounts that were or were not related to Russian meddling that the company discovered during its investigation. Although the accounts supported the protests at Standing Rock, BuzzFeed News did not find evidence the group had contacted activists to organize protests, similar to what was successfully done in Charlotte, North Carolina, with unwitting Black Lives Matter activists. An interesting point in all of this. And with just a few minutes left, a very few minutes left, let's toss this into the mix as well, because this is becoming a big point too. Both the Daily Beast and Think Progress doing some work on this one. Think Progress is reporting based on what? We'll take a look at who their sources are on this one. Let's see. Well, a couple of different sources. Let me take, though, just because we got to take one or two. Well, I'll take 2 headlines on this one. The Think Progress headline, the mysterious Florida company connected to Russian propaganda websites, Green Floyd, Floyd, as in, I don't know, that's Pink Floyd turned green and misspelled, Green Floyd LLC. A little bit more detail offered here in the BuzzFeed story later on, at least in terms of where the locus of this activity is. Russian propaganda hosted by man on Staten Island, not Florida. It seems that the business was incorporated in Florida, but run by, once again, 2 or 3 guys on their own based in Staten Island, and you'll never guess what kind of folks these are. Russian propaganda campaign targeting Americans was hosted, at least in part, on American soil, the BuzzFeed story says. A company owned by a man in Staten Island, New York, provided internet infrastructure services to DoNotShoot.us, a Kremlin propaganda site that pretended to be a voice for victims of police shootings, a Daily Beast investigation has found. Every website needs to be hosted, of course, that is to say, given an internet protocol address and space on a physical computer in order to be publicly viewed. Thanks for explaining that one. DoNotShoot.us is a website run out of the Kremlin-backed Russian troll farm, according to 2 sources familiar with the site, both of whom independently identified it to the Daily Beast as a Russian propaganda account. The IP address was owned by Green Floyd LLC, same place, a company registered to New Yorker Sergei Kashurin. Gee whiz, I wonder where Sergei Kashurin derives his name from. And 2 others. Other Russian propaganda sites like BlackMattersUS.com were also hosted on servers with IP addresses owned by Green Floyd. The company's ties to Russian propaganda sites were first reported by Think Progress. Aha! So good. Credit now to Think Progress. Here, I thought Think Progress might have been leaning on someone else, as they frequently do, but their own investigation there. Excellent. Should have been reading their work. The web services company owns under 250 IP addresses, some of which resolve to Russian propaganda sites and other fake news operations. Others are sites that could not be hosted at other providers like xxxrape.net. Sounds like a fun bunch of guys. They do. There's also a Russian trinket site called Soviet-power.com. The IP address that pointed to DoNotShoot.us now resolves to a botnet and phishing operation and is currently owned by Total Server Solutions, LLC. Sounds like a pretty fishy, shady operation. The use of a tiny, no-questions-asked hosting company run by a man living in New York shows the Kremlin-backed troll farm's brazen use of Americans and American companies to conduct its disinformation campaign, although I suppose that there's some question about just how American Sergei Kashurin may be, though he lives in Staten Island, and that's a fairly American place to live, all told, I suppose. But frequently popping up in these Trump-Russia stories, lots of naturalized American citizens that began as Russian citizens or Russian satellite country citizens as well, and a lot of question marks popping up there, and it's a difficult thing, and I think they probably knew this, given how interested they are in exploiting fracture lines in American politics. Liberals and progressives are going to be initially, I think, loath to question folks who have become naturalized American citizens because they're so frequently the target of right-wing anger. But interestingly, blurring the lines here come now the Russian folks who may or may not have settled here with the intent of actually helping their original country undermine the operations and stability and political independence of the United States. Worrisome and weird because it ends up making us look like we're advocating from the position of the old John Birchers. A success, no doubt, for them in their endeavors. Okay, time now to hand things over to the guys on the after show for them to bat cleanup. I over-talked my opportunity to tell you what was coming up. We'll see what we can squeeze in, and looks really super interesting out of all of their great stuff after this.
From Daily Kos Radio on networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
We'll squeeze all this in. Fox News criticized Hillary Clinton for cursing on a British adult talk show. 2 followers of renegade Nevada rancher Cliven Bundy plead guilty over the armed 2014 standoff. We've been waiting for that one. And James O'Keefe back in the news. He wants you to think he's a journalist, but his overwhelming dishonesty proves otherwise. Stay tuned.